at some level in
China and this close relationship developing between China and Israel, and a Chinese role in a lot of espionage operations and selling out and outsourcing of U.S. The most sensitive military technological secrets of the U.S. government. So and I just wanted to throw that I guess prelude into what we're going to be reading from here.
Yes, well, thank you for that, and it made me think of that, that I remember just a few months ago, and I think this is important for us to remember about how fast things are moving in terms of the analysis that we might have to do and help lead the way intellectually, if we can, in terms of refocusing people on what really matters here. Is just a few months ago, we would go to the central branch of the Kansas City Public Library, and I would have no doubt that when I looked up the book Israel Super Spy, Robert Maxwell, Israel Super Spy, that it would be there, and it was an obscure book. But now here we are, just a few months later, and that book is at the epicenter of what you can imagine is dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands, of people's investigations now, including mainstream journalists and independent analysts into who Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's partner in his organized crime spree, and the network that involves all of that. So I think it's just it's important for us to remember of how rapidly this is evolving, and that we need to stay focused on the truth to guide us forward here. So let me read a little bit from these early pages of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. I mean, we have to remember Gordon Thomas, he's got his own angle here. He's obviously got some, he had, I believe he's deceased now, but I'm sure he had strong connections, obviously, to certain aspects of intelligence communities, very likely high levels of UK MI6. But meanwhile, this information here is very interesting. So I'm going to just read a little bit from...
Gordon Thomas died in March of 2017, by the way.
So page 23, quote, George Tenet also knew that though Lee had not been a CSIS spy, by the way, he's talking about the Wenho Lee, the allegations against Wenho Lee as being part of a Chinese spy operation. And
yes, Chinese scientist who worked at Los Alamos, I believe, and this happened in the late 90s when the scandal took place.
And this is interesting because Wenho Lee begins to look like a scapegoat for these higher levels of this conjunction of Israeli intelligence and Chinese. But we'll read it and it'll come out. That Lee had not been George Tenet also knew that though Lee had not been a CSIS spy, China's Secret Intelligence Service had carried out its penetration of Los Alamos almost certainly with the help of another foreign intelligence service. On paper, that service was deemed to be the closest of all friendly intelligence agencies to the American intelligence community. The service was Mossad, the external intelligence agency of Israel. When Tenet had come into office, he had read two documents written by his predecessors. The first was penned by William Casey on March 21, 1984. Quote, a nation creates the intelligence community it needs. America relies on technical expertise because we are concerned to discover rather than secretly rule. The Israelis operate differently. Mossad in particular equates its actions with its nation's survival, unquote. The second document was written by Robert Michael Gates, a mere week after he became director of the CIA on December 15, 1986. Quote, Mossad's most celebrated director, Meir Amit, has said that the Mossad should live by the credo, Israel first, last, and always. Always. We must never be caught going through the pockets of our friends. The key word is caught, unquote. Commenting on that adage, Gates had detailed Mossad's increased penetration of the United States through economic, scientific, and technological espionage. A special Israeli unit codenamed AL, A-L, Hebrew for above. And aside, does that sound like above Israeli intelligence, potentially? So what's the relationship of Mega and Al?
And you look up Al, do a Google search for Al in Israeli, you won't find anything. Very interesting.
This is the only reference that I can find to it on the record, really.
And just like Mega was previously obscure up until recently, now we'll see if anything can be dug up on this in the future. We'll see.
So a specially Israeli unit codenamed AL, Hebrew for above, had been set up to prowl through California's Silicon Valley and Boston's Route 128 for high-tech secrets. In his report to the Senate Intelligence Committee, another of Tenet's predecessors, Bobby Ray Inman, had identified Israel as one of 6 foreign nations with a, quote, government-directed, orchestrated, and clandestine effort to steal U.S. military and economic secrets, unquote. Tenet had not forgotten that another on the list was China. Now, though he still could not prove it in a way that a court of law would demand proof, he was very certain that the Los Alamos operation had been a joint venture between Mossad and CSIS. For China, the accruing benefits had been easy to understand, access to secrets that no other country possessed. For Israel, those secrets were also beyond price. But to share them with China, Israel had demanded an extra price, access to other technology that China was developing, which would give Israel a lead over its Arab neighbors in such vital areas as agriculture, water desalination, and the other requirements that would ensure the country would continue to prosper and blossom in the arid landscape of their forefathers. Israel would also receive China's latest weapons technology, as advanced as that of the United States. George Tenet, so his friends later said, had thought long and hard about how much of all of this he should reveal to the Bush transition team. Those same friends had no doubt that as his limousine eased its way through the traffic on its 9-mile journey into Washington, the question would still be uppermost in his mind, unquote. And so this whole section is talking about like the Tenet's, what Tenet is going to brief the incoming George W. Bush administration on in terms of his own concerns. I just want to make one point, is that I read that it appeared that until John O'Neill looks like he sort of got framed for a stealing of his briefcase, very likely by someone interested in what he knew about the involvement of Israeli intelligence networks surrounding Manhattan in the run-up to 9/11, that he was apparently in the running for the position of the national security, the counterterrorism-focused national security advisor that Richard Clarke held during the Clinton administration and then went over into the W. Bush administration. And I pointed out that I believe there's a troika of dicks surrounding September 11th. Dick Clark, Dick Pearl, and Dick Cheney.
Very good. I wouldn't argue with that. And real quick, with regards to Tenet, we're not going to go into this. I just want to throw this in with Tenet and this information that he was putting out, that he was contemplating giving to the Bush administration regarding all of this historical information, is that Tenet and the CIA were very much seen. Tenet CIA, even though Tenet ultimately, as you mentioned with Colin Powell, ultimately made the Iraq War possible via the whole, the UN speech about anthrax and all of that. But I mean, it is Tenet CIA was considered hostile by the real hardcore elements within operating out of Cheney circles that were pushing the primary post 9/11 propaganda of the war on terror, not just the Iraq War, but the overall war on terror. And it's interesting in regards to Michael Maloof at RT's former Feith Wormser direct associate, his anger, it seems, at the Tenet gang and that the CIA was motivated by political partisanship to ignore the findings of Maloof, Wormser, and Feith and company. And so and so how much of this is related to an element within the intelligence agencies that are very much, as we know, a lot of the U.S. Establishment intelligence has been in national security has very much been very hostile, or at least has tried to push back against a lot of this Israeli influence in terms of Israeli domination in a lot of areas from a very hardcore Zionist perspective. And so how much of this continued hostility towards the deep state and these elements of the CIA is related to this history here, and of this perceived hostility to the findings of these heroic people post September 11th. So I just had to throw that in there with regards to Tenet.
Okay, and in our last 5 minutes, so just try to get through this next section of this book, which is interesting that the other concern that Tenet apparently had that he wanted to, he didn't know whether to brief the incoming administration on was, okay, one we've already established was this question of Israeli intelligence involvement with China in severe penetrations of U.S. national security apparatus, specifically the nuclear network. But then the other one is the involvement of the Ukrainian-centric Russian Jewish organized crime mobs surrounding people like Semyon Mogilevich in relationship to the trucking and bartering of nuclear materials globally, including other things. Now, I never knew that this is what was front and foremost on DCI Tenet's mind as the incoming W. Bush administration was seeking his continued service. But I guess that's what was going on. So that is very, very interesting. And when you say that, Greg, in terms of this question of the deep state and the question of, the sort of mass of CIA and all that, it reminds me of the Gary Vogler book and the show we did about that, about the war for Iraq war for oil for Israel, and how this is someone who was close to it and did not figure out what was actually going on until many years later, and then he was able to piece together, oh, that's why Douglas Feith was overriding Department of Defense security clearance concerns with people like Michael Mokovsky, the eventual head of Jewish Institute of National Security Affairs, to oversee the post-Iraq oil scenario, and realized that Mokovsky had been sent to Israel for the Foreign Service for 5 years and was thus obviously Israeli intelligence. So there in the background here, I think more and more people are going to discover how powerful this Israeli influence, and we might even say colonization or domination of this level of our security politics really is. But I'll just read a little bit more through this, Greg, if that's okay, and then we'll just...
Yes, and this will probably take up through the rest of our time here. But whatever we don't get into, we recommend certainly Gideon's Seeds of Fire and reading this information for anybody who themselves wants to dig deeper in this. But we'll get what we can out of these last few minutes here.
Okay, so here's page 25 where it's talking about what the other papers that Tenet wants to brief on. Quote, 2 of the documents concern the Russian mafia. The first dealt with the mafia's relationship with the Mossad. It contained the revelation that the Israeli agency could soon be asked to move its European headquarters in Holland following highly embarrassing claims that Mossad had been secretly buying plutonium and other nuclear materials from the Russian mafia. The allegation had come from a CIA agent in Amsterdam who had picked it up from Intel, the small but formidable division of Dutch intelligence. Intel operated from a deep bunker near Amsterdam's Central Railway Station. The bunker had ironically been built to shelter the Dutch royal family in the event of Soviet nuclear attack on the city at the height of the Cold War. The CIA agent's report said that the most of the nuclear material had been stolen by the mafia from Russian weapons labs such as Chelyabinsk 70 in the Ural Mountains and Arsama 16 in the Nizhny Novgorod, formerly Gorky. Senior Mossad officers had insisted to Intel that precisely because the deadly materials were stolen, their agents had purchased them from the Russian mafia. It was the only sure way to stop the materials from being sold to Islamic and other terror groups. While conceding that the Mossad claim was plausible, Intel investigators had become convinced that the nuclear materials had been secretly shipped out of Amsterdam's Schiphol airport to boost Israel's own nuclear weapons manufacturing plant at Dimona in the Negev desert. Already stockpiled there were an estimated 200 nuclear weapons. For Tenet, knowing Mossad was trafficking with the Russian mafia had rekindled a nuclear nightmare that had never quite gone away. So this, we're not going to be able to get to all this, but I just want to point out that people didn't believe that explanation by Israeli intelligence about this material. And I would point out, we'll link to some stories on Veterans Today that basically say that Colonel Jim Hankey, who was in Israel, had seen that in the late 80s, early 90s, that Dimona had already gone critical and that they were not able to produce their indigenous nuclear weapons material. And so this is obviously what Israeli intelligence was actually doing. And my question is that what ended up in terms of ground zero on September 11th? So until next week, Greg,
you're about to see must not leave this room. All right, Dallas, 1963. There is a cat. Moscow, 1991. There is a cat. Here are some stairs. There is a cat. New Orleans, 2005. There is a cat.
But what we're seeing is that we're being observed or manipulated by a cat or a number of cats.